Seems to have crept up to us. I can't even speak. That's how shook I am by how quickly this has come around. It's crept up on us. This has.
It has. But if you are watching on the live chat, then do get in touch on YouTube.
Yep, give us a wave.
And if we are being heard on podcasts, you have no way of interacting with us. You just have to sit there and listen.
Yeah.
Yes, we are talking about Richard Dawkins, who has tweeted again.
Yeah.
We should just set an alert on Twitter so that every time he tweets, just get ready to be outraged and yeah. Okay. Okay.
There's nothing appeared on the feed actually, so it doesn't look like we are live. Give us a wave.
Oh. We cannot be seen.
Maybe we can't be seen, but there's
hello.
Audio.
Can you hear us but not see us? That's probably best, to be honest.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now we're in HD.
Paul and Glen should be.
For those of you on the podcast, you are the blessed ones.
So this is going out, and
well, presumably. Maybe one of these 6 people who's watching could say something and let us know. But 7
people. Hello, everybody.
Can hear but can't see, says Cy Hollett. So there we are. Look.
Hello, Cy.
Well, don't look. Just
hello, Cy. And look, we've had 3 comments now. What's this?
We're somewhat invisible. Yep.
Somewhat invisible.
Everyone's saying, "Oh, look, we're on the screen. We're on the screen."
Are we now?
We're all good. We're all good. We're in now. Okay.
Good.
Well, this has been our usual smooth beginning to the live cast, which is great. So
thanks for sticking with us, guys. We value you guys. But we're talking about how do we value people? Okay?
Yes.
There's a segue. I'm not saying it's a good one, but there's
no,
a segue.
but we're in. That's fine. Dawkins, back on it.
Richard Dawkins has tweeted. I mean, if that's not newsworthy, then nothing is. And his tweets over the weekend, they've had the quality that many of his tweets have had. It sounds as though you're coming in halfway on a conversation.
Sure.
In which he's very agitated about something, but it's not exactly clear what.
No, there's definitely a case of you feel he's responding to something,
yes,
but you're not sure where it's come from.
Right.
You've missed half the conversation.
Right.
So, yes.
So, and we've done a bit of digging because he tweeted out about eugenics. Eugenics is good genes, okay? It's the idea, that's what the Greek word means. It's about wanting to shape the evolution of your species. If Darwin has said the fittest do survive, then a eugenicist says, and the fittest should survive.
Okay.
And so they want to do some social engineering, some social Darwinism, and make sure that the fittest kinds of people pass on their genes to the rest. And so that's what Dawkins was tweeting about. Mm-hmm. Why he was tweeting about it, we weren't quite clear until Paul did a little bit of research about eugenics in the news. What did you discover?
Well, and it just happened to come up, and I assume this is what Dawkins is stepping off from, about the appointment of this guy called Andrew Sabisky, who's been appointed as an aide to Dominic Cummings, who I believe is an aide to Boris Johnson. So he's an aide of an aide.
An aide to an aide.
Aide to an aide, who has appointed this guy as... Apparently, Dominic Cummings put out a job description for more misfits and weirdos to join them in number 10, which I thought was perfect.
Not more.
As if we needed any more. So, and which this guy, Andrew Sabisky, has been appointed, therefore. And he's controversial because of some of the things he said in the past.
Wait a minute, Paul. Are you saying that somebody has been appointed to a public office and journalists have gone through their social media posts?
Well, I know. Would you believe it? That? Could you believe that such a thing would happen?
They've discovered some controversial material?
Discovered, yes.
No way.
Yes, they've definitely discovered some controversial material.
Okay.
So back in 2014, he talked about in order to kind of get around unplanned pregnancies, there should be a kind of legal enforcement of long-term contraception from puberty. So he was basically to avoid creating a permanent underclass.
Wow.
He said there.
Which surely that is sterilizing the poor. Isn't that what he's saying?
Yes, and that's exactly what a number of the articles pointed out. Yes.
Right.
So he'd said that.
Okay.
He'd also commented about how in the States, he said black people have a lower IQ than white people and are more likely to be intellectually disabled. Mm-hmm. He said... an exact quote on Twitter, "I'm straight up in saying that women's sport is more comparable to the Paralympics than it is to men's."
Oh, man!
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Yep. And then, again, and this is where the kind of eugenics things came from. He said eugenics are about selecting 4 good things. Mm-hmm. Intelligence is largely inherited and correlates with better outcomes, physical health, income, lower mental illness and stuff like that. So he's obviously up for a bit of eugenics.
He's wanting to get eugenics into the public discourse.
Yeah,
Let's start a conversation,
and he's
people.
keen on, better...
It's not dysgenics, it's you means good.
The good genics. The good types of genics, right? That's the ones we want. And I mean, so... So there was also this thing he'd said about this narcolepsy drug.
About good genetics. Yeah.
So there's also this thing about this narcolepsy drug, which potentially could help brain function,
right.
But also there was the potential of a life-threatening illness from it. And he said, from a societal perspective, the benefits of giving everyone this drug once a week are probably worth a dead kid once a year.
Wow.
So
he's done the maths.
Yeah, welcome to number 10. Come join us.
Wow, welcome to Brave New World, which also happens to be number 10. So he's done the math. On the one hand, we'd all have slightly higher IQs. Is that the idea?
That's seemingly.
But that would be worth a dead kid.
Worth one dead kid.
One dead kid.
One kid, not two. Obviously, that's ridiculous.
He's not a monster. He's not gonna. Oh man. So as of today, he still has a job.
Yes.
I think so.
We'll see.
Okay.
We'll see.
So what was interesting is that, so a lot of pieces have been made about this brave new world that Andrew Sabisky is kind of advocating for. Mm-hmm. But Richard Dawkins wants to jump in to the public discussion.
Yep.
And instead, he says this, and I think he tweeted this out yesterday, February the 16th. He said, "It's one thing to deplore eugenics on ideological, political, moral grounds. It's quite another to conclude that it wouldn't work in practice. Of course it would. It works for cows, horses, pigs, dogs, and roses. Why on earth wouldn't it work for humans?"
Well, good, as long as we cleared that up.
Facts ignore ideology was the way he finished that. Isn't that something? Isn't that something?
Absolutely, yes.
So he just wants everybody, we're all piling on to eugenics. And he's like, come on, guys, look, I know that we've got ideological, political, and moral objections to it. But it would work. It has that in its favor. We might actually pull this thing off. We've done it with cows. I'm just saying. Everyone likes roses, right? That's eugenics. Just saying. I'm just saying. Don't bring your ideology at me. It's just the facts, man. And then, so obviously that tweet stirred up a little bit of controversy. And then Richard Dawkins is brilliant at this. He'll tweet these ridiculous tweets and then go, "What? What? I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking." So his follow-up tweet was, "For those determined to miss the point, I deplore the idea of a eugenic policy." No, you don't, Richard. And we'll see why in a second. But Richard Dawkins continues, "I simply said deploring it doesn't mean it wouldn't work." I just want you to be really clear. This thing could happen. It could totally fly. We have the technology. He goes on, "Just as we breed cows to yield more milk, we could breed. I'm not saying we should. I'm just saying we could breed humans to run faster or jump higher or have higher IQ, which is the much more contentious attribute that always gets hooked onto."
And the real clincher at the end there.
The clincher is, "But heaven forbid that we should do it." Now you want heaven, Richard?
Yeah. That noise in the background was the irony meter exploding.
Heaven forbid that we should. And we're going to see that only heaven does forbid eugenics. I don't think anything else can properly exclude that possibility. And then he did another follow-up tweet because for some reason that didn't clarify everything in people's minds. He wasn't able to stem the bleeding with that. And then he said, "A eugenic policy would be bad." No, it wouldn't. It's in the name.
Yeah. It's good genics.
Good genics.
We've already worked this out.
We've established it's good genics. It would be bad. I'm combating the illogical step from X would be bad to so X is impossible. It would work. I just want you all to know, guys. It would work in the same sense as it works for cows. Let's fight it on moral grounds. Deny obvious scientific facts and we lose, or at best derail the argument. So it just seems odd when all the flurry around Andrew Sabisky was about, oh gosh, this is a bit disturbing. The one thing that Richard Dawkins wants us all to be very aware of in these 3 tweets is it would work.
It could work, people.
I'm just saying it would work. Sure, it's bad, but it would work.
And as you said, he says, I'm not saying we should do it, I'm saying it's deplorable. But Richard, your previous statements don't seem to back that up very much.
No.
So back in 2014, he was involved in a little tweet kind of conversation, which you can still find on his Twitter feed if you go and search for it.
He has not taken down these tweets.
No, so someone called @InYourFaceNY, presumably New Yorker, who's very in your face.
Aren't they all? I'm from New York. Forget about it.
They said, I honestly don't know what I would do if I were pregnant with a kid with Down syndrome. Real ethical dilemma. To which Richard Dawkins replied, abort it and try again. It would be immoral to bring it into the world if you have the choice. So I'm not saying you should do eugenics. That'd be bad. But I mean, obviously, I'm not talking about the Down syndrome kids. Let's get rid of them because they're obviously bad. But
crazy.
Abort
it and try again. That phrase has been echoing around my head for the 6 years since he tweeted that. Abort it and try again. And then I forgot how horrendous the next sentence is. Abort it and try again, he says, it would be immoral to bring it into the world if you have a choice.
Immoral. Yeah. Not just kind of like, it would be hard. It would be difficult for you.
Yeah.
It would be immoral. You are a moral monster for bringing a child with Down syndrome into the world.
It's so
be one of the good people.
Abort it.
Yeah.
Be one of the good people. That's morality. That's good genetics, right? And it's not even, hey, well done you for loving your disabled child. Well done you for embracing the disability.
Immoral.
You are immoral for allowing a disabled child into the human race. This is absolutely horrendous. Abort it and try again. So when he tries to say he's against eugenics, in what sense, Richard, are you against eugenics? People might say that aborting on the basis of disability is not eugenics, but I think they must be a far subtler philosopher than I am if they can figure out what the difference is between aborting on the basis of, which is why when I had my debate with Matt Dillahunty, I raised the issue of aborting people with Down syndrome. And this is happening. There is no single human being in Iceland at the moment under the age of 5 with Down syndrome. You know why? Because they abort 100% of them. There's a non-invasive prenatal test. Every mother gets it, and every mother aborts on the basis of disability. What do you call that? If you've eliminated a subgroup of the human species, what do you call that if it's not eugenics? And Dawkins is on board with that. In fact, he thinks it would be immoral for those women to discover Downs in the womb and to have the child. He thinks it would be immoral. What do you call it? But he's not for eugenics. God, heaven forbid. Heaven forbid.
I think it's Richard Dawkins to pontificate on morality as well.
Yes.
Given that his expertise lies merely in biological matters.
Yes.
To feel he's got any weight weighing in on these issues seems to be.
Yes, he's pronouncing way outside of his domain. Interestingly, Roger Marshall on Top Chat has just said, given the eugenic policies implicitly endorsed in The Descent of Man by Darwin, who is Dawkins' intellectual hero, Dawkins' disapproval on moral grounds sounds very weak. And that's the issue. I mean, Darwin... obviously, Darwin didn't come up with the phrase survival of the fittest. I think that was Huxley who popularized that, but he very much taught the survival of the fittest. The fittest do survive.
Sure.
But then it's a hop, skip, and a jump from saying the fittest do survive to saying the fittest should survive.
Yeah.
And if all we're dealing with is biological reality, then surely that's going to give us our morality. We don't believe in God. We don't actually believe in heaven. We don't actually believe in any Platonic forms or ideals of morality. So all we're dealing with is the biological realm. So surely the only place we derive our shoulds is the biological realm. In which case, the fittest should survive. How do you stop Darwinism becoming social Darwinism? How do you actually do that unless you have a heaven to forbid it?
Yep.
And Darwin doesn't have a heaven to forbid it. But he doesn't even seem to... be aware of the limits of his own framework, because he's a biologist who thinks that because he's a very clever scientist, and he is, that he can therefore pronounce on matters political moral, and religious. And
Well, I think, it's because he believes there is nothing more than the biological reality.
Yes.
He has to pronounce on those things from a biological standpoint.
Right.
Because
Yes.
that's all he's got.
Right.
He doesn't believe there's anything else to rely on.
Right.
So
Right.
it's by constantly making noise from that end, that
Yes.
perspective,
Yeah.
he's just trying to bolster his
Yeah.
position.
Everything is biology. Yeah, exactly. And it's so obvious that everything is not just biology because of the paucity of his arguments when he gets out of his biological domain. Something pointed out by Terry Eagleton when he reviewed Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion. It's the most delicious little book review you've ever read in your life. Back in 2006 when The God Delusion came out. The first line of it is, imagine someone holding forth on biology whose only knowledge of the subject is the Book of British Birds, and you have a rough idea of what it feels like to read Richard Dawkins on theology. Thank you, Terry Eagleton. He then goes on to say that the God Delusion is all about banging at open doors and shooting at straw targets, and beautifully done, beautifully done. But one area in which Dawkins, he looks at his biological knowledge and he then tries to apply it to other realms, is he says, okay, in the biological realm, we don't have these sharp differences between species. We might talk about different species. There's a species of dogs and a species of cats, but actually we're all on this grand continuum, and therefore we shouldn't have kind of on and off switches when we think about life. We should have a dimmer switch when we think about life. It's a continuous thing. Everything's on a continuum, and he takes that truth from biology, or what he would claim to be a truth from biology, and he then applies it to everything else, including morality. And so he talks about the tyranny of the discontinuous mind. He doesn't see why anyone thinks in on and off terms. Why would anyone think in dimmer switch terms when they're thinking about the value of a human being? Surely the value of a human being is on a dimmer switch, right? It's not discontinuous, is it? And so he wrote this in The Guardian in 2015. He said, moral controversies, such as those over abortion and euthanasia, are riddled with the same infection, this idea of essentialism, this tyranny of the discontinuous mind. At what point is a brain-dead accident victim defined as dead? At what moment during development does an embryo become a person? Only a mind infected with essentialism would ask such questions. An embryo develops gradually from single-celled zygote to newborn baby, and there's no one instant when personhood should be deemed to have arrived. The world is divided into those who get this truth and those who wail, but there has to be some moment when the fetus becomes human. I just think that's hilarious. It's like the world is divided into two camps, but it's only the two camps of there's the continual, those who believe in the continuum and those who believe in human rights, right? And then he says, no, there doesn't have to be a moment when a fetus becomes a human, any more than there has to be a day when a middle-aged person becomes old. It would be better, though still not ideal, to say the embryo goes through stages of being a quarter human, half human, three-quarters human, ... The essentialist mind will recoil from such language, yes, and accuse me of all manners of horrors for denying the essence of humanness.
So he subtly switches there, doesn't he, between person and human.
Yes.
So he talks about when personhood arrives, and then he says, but people will wail, there has to be a moment when it becomes human, and you can say, no, you can be a quarter human or not. I mean, but scientifically, right from conception, the embryo is human. It's regardless of any ideology. Yeah. Just from a scientific standpoint, that you can't take that tissue and go, oh, this is going to become a dog, or a cow. Like, it's human.
If it's a quarter human, is it three-quarters badger?
Yeah, what's going on in the rest?
So, but I mean, there is a distinction to be made. Maybe people might want to make a distinction between humans and persons. Actually, a humanist won't want to, and a Christian humanist won't want to, because they just want to say all human beings are worthy of all provision and protection. They are persons. Legally speaking, they're to be treated as persons. But yeah, there is that distinction perhaps to be made between your biological reality as a human and your legal reality as a person who has inviolable dignity. But Richard Dawkins wants to put it on a dimmer switch, and he uses fractions, quarter, half, three-quarters. And I wonder if he's not getting the historical connection because he's picked those particular fractions. I wonder if he chose the fraction 3/5, whether that would jog his mind about this historical reality of we have valued people at less than 100%.
Yeah.
And, you know, in the history of the US, slaves were counted as 3/5 of a human being. You know, from 1787 right up until slavery was ended in 1868, slaves were counted as 3/5 of a human being, right? And quite rightly, we look back at that and say, that's no good. That is not ideal.
No, reprehensible.
Yes, that would be another word for it.
Abhorrent.
Abhorrent.
You know?
Yes, evil, perhaps.
Any of those.
But Dawkins is like, oh no, but within the womb, 1/4, half, 3/4.
What I don't understand is why he feels it ends like
at
birth.
Right.
Like there's that switch.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Why such an on and off thing?
Well, it's the magical birth canal, Paul.
Yeah.
The magical birth canal conveys all your human rights on you.
It's so dangerous, isn't it, to talk of, you know, like particularly if you're saying, well, in terms of to these things are human, but actually maybe they're only half human or quarter human. But what defines when are you fully human?
Right.
You know, is it when you're born?
Right.
Is it when you're 2, when you're 3? You know,
right.
What is it? Can you decline back again? I don't know.
Yeah. It's like when I debated Matt Dillahunty, he said, I don't believe that humans have intrinsic moral value. I think they have incredible value. I don't think they have inherent intrinsic moral value, but I value them. And I said, you value them all? And he says, yeah, well. And then he says, the humans who are able to conceive whether they have value or not, those are the ones that I value. Which, you know, I've got a 2-year-old. I'm not quite sure he's quite grasped his own human value now, you know?
No, and neither would a newborn or
no,
a bit younger than that.
And Peter Singer, the atheist ethicist, says that actually, you know, why do we draw the line at birth? You know, surely you could talk about post-birth abortions, couldn't you? And this is why atheists like Peter Singer would never sign a humanist manifesto, because they're not humanists.
Yeah.
They think humanism is speciesism, for precisely the reasons that Dawkins gives here, that we're all on a continuum, and therefore why should we value a sort of a non-cognizant 6-month-old baby when like a pig might have more conscious activity going on. You know, that's a baboon definitely does, than a 6-month-old baby. You need to have a discontinuous mind. You need to have the on or off switch. You can't have the dimmer switch and human rights. Yet one more reason why it is heaven that forbids you to think in these sorts of ways.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we miss, don't we? So people do kind of think, well, you know, these things are an obvious thing. That it's obvious that actually everyone should have their human rights and stuff, but actually that's not the case at all when you boil it back. And I think, you know, I can't remember if it came up in your discussion with Tom Holland, but certainly that notion of being that we swim in the water of Christianity. We're so unaware of how infused we are with the Christian worldview that we just assume that human rights are there.
Right.
The idea that people shouldn't have human rights or don't have human rights.
Right.
We can't even conceive of that almost.
Yes. Yeah.
Without being pulled out of it.
Yes. Yeah. That was my experience last week. So I went to Dundee University last week to speak to the students there, and one of my talks was on where do human rights come from, and you could just hear the cogs whirring within students' minds. They'd never really considered.
Yeah.
It was
you
just
just have human rights. Yeah. Of course you have human rights.
Yeah. And it was like, and I'm so glad in one sense that this is this bedrock kind of morality that people have.
Yeah.
Oh, but that would violate equality. Well, I'm glad you believe in equality, but why do you believe in equality?
Yeah. You need, and like you say, we've said before, you need to have the foundation, don't you, for it? Because if you don't have the foundation, there's no reason you can't just start to pick it apart.
Yes.
You know, and actually that is the benefit is that, of course, even if people haven't thought about it, people still do want those human rights.
Yes.
People do generally kind of go, oh, well, of course people should have these things, but they're not necessarily inherent.
No.
Like they exist. And I think, you know, we've got a clip from Yuval Noah Harari where he talks about human rights and, you know, whether they're obvious or not really.
Yeah, let's have a look at that.
Okay. So it looks like we couldn't quite get that clip up, but he talks in the clip, doesn't he, about how that actually these things are just stories that maybe in the last 200 years or so we've these human rights have come out of stories in the last 200 years. And the thing I like about it, what he says is you could effectively say, well, yeah. And I like, because people don't necessarily think about it; they just assume they're there. Mm-hmm. But he helpfully points out, but they don't have to be there.
Yeah. He said, if I cut you open, I'll find heart, lung, liver, neurons.
Yeah.
Where exactly are your human rights?
Yeah.
Where
are they located?
Find
them. There's nothing there to weigh.
Yeah.
You can't put it under the microscope and discover it.
Right.
Yeah.
But he says that, it exists in stories that are just like the stories of God, right? Which also, he would say, is a total fiction, no objective reality to it. But it has helped us to cooperate as a society, to believe these stories, to tell these stories. And so, let's keep on telling these stories. But, I don't know, until another storyteller comes along and says, I've got a dream of a master race. Who's with me?
Yeah, absolutely.
And at that stage, there's the master race vision, and there's your human equality vision. Like, what is it up here that says that's wrong and that's right?
Sure, absolutely. And again, it just comes back down to that. It's the foundation, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you've got no foundation, nothing higher to appeal to, it comes down to, well, who's going to win in this battle? Or it's whoever's the strongest comes out on top. We can bully you through this and win it. So unless there's objective moral value, everything just becomes about force. Yeah.
And I've got more power than you to impose my will. Christoph Keating has made the good point that often the 3/5 of a human point is misunderstood. It was actually the slavers who wanted their slaves to be valued at fully one slave, because the more slaves were in the state, the more representatives they could send to Congress. That's true. That's true. But it's come to represent something different, perhaps, to what it did mean historically. But still, that idea of somebody being worth 60% of a human being, is out there. And it's precisely what allows you to say, hey, let's everybody take this drug. It will increase IQ, and it will mean that one kid dies every year. What it means is that kid is not infinitely valuable. That kid can be traded off against all these other goods. Or, like Richard Dawkins talking about Down syndrome in the womb, those people are definitely worth less. A quarter, perhaps they're even an eighth, according to Richard Dawkins.
And the problem is, it's just they just become arbitrary lines. Like, as to where you decide, is it one kid? Is it about the numbers of people?
Yeah.
Or is it about people's physical ability?
Yeah.
Is it blonde hair and blue eyes?
Yeah.
What is it? And there's nothing to stop you going in any direction with it.
Yeah.
If there's nothing there to underpin it.
And while we're on the subject of slavery, the only way you can end slavery is if you get rid of this consequentialist mindset. The consequentialist mindset is a moral action is moral if it adds to the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And so you can trade off even the death of people if it will somehow, through the calculus, raise the well-being of the rest of society in general. And the thing was, the slavers being in charge of these measures of well-being, they would always say, well, it's great for the economy. I mean, our numbers are through the roof because we've got these slaves. The only people who are ever going to be able to end slavery are not going to be consequentialists. They're going to be people who believe in moral absolutes, who have their Bibles open, who go to the first page and see that we're all created in God's image, as we'll see. Justin Hark has said, it's good to have quiet time just to reflect. So I think he's commenting on our... on our technological failures there.
Right.
Will we have other quiet time? Do you reckon we could give a go of the second clip, which, no, probably not. Okay, there's another clip we're going to play you, which is from the Jordan Peterson Ding versus Sam Harris debates.
Oh,
you got it?
This is just an ordinary glass. I know it looks just like that one, but this is the glass that Elton John drank from in his last concert here, right?
Right.
So, what do you want to pay me for it, right?
Right.
It could be that, you're just the biggest Elton John fan ever, and it's worth quite a lot to you. Now that is, it's a kind of evident, it's not value intrinsic to the glass, but
Right.
it is a,
Where's the value located?
well, it's a measure in the change this provokes in your experience. So this is the reason why Israel and the Israelis and the Palestinians can't negotiate as though their problems could be solved by a real estate transaction is because they have irrational and irreconcilable claims upon land and buildings.
Do you think they're any
Actually,
more?
I don't
Do you
think
think
we know
they're any
that.
more irrational than the claim that glass is worth something
Well,
more?
no, it's
because
just,
it was
it's
near-
like that. The true analogy here, the complete analogy is rather like we're about to fight over Elton John's glass, and Elton John was never here. Right.
Well,
was basically picking up a glass of water, and he said, this glass of water in itself is worthless, but if I told you that Elton John, who's just played at the stadium that they were in, it was the glass that he drank from, it suddenly becomes worth a heck of a lot more than the contents of that glass of water. And then Sam Harris uses that as an analogy for Palestine, and he says, look, we've got this strip of land at the end of the Mediterranean, and its market value is being inflated massively by these religious stories about the significance of the land. And there's a Christian story, and there's a Jewish story, and there's a Muslim story, and they are massively inflating the value of that piece of land to the point where people are ready to die for a strip of land, and they can't handle it like it's a real estate transaction. Why can't we get rid of these mythological stories and just deal with the land of Palestine like just the land that it is? Let's value it at what the market will bear.
Sure.
Now, at that stage, hooray,
Yeah.
I'm on board.
No problem.
No problem. But when it comes to the human person, what if the glass is not an analogy of the land of Palestine? What if the glass is an analogy for the human person? Well, at that stage, I'm very glad that there is a story of someone from outside humanity who values the human person and values the human person far above the material contents that lie within my skin.
Yep.
Because the material contents that lie within my skin, I'm worth about the same as a Big Mac. If you boil down the minerals within me, right? Or how else are you going to measure me? Maybe if I sold my kidney, I'd get more than a $5 for my kidney. But
is there not a danger in that as well? Is saying the value of, you've got the value of the glass, which is the thing, but then the contents of the glass as well. Potentially, you could be talking about the qualities as well.
Right.
So,
exactly.
So a glass of, you might look at one person and say, well, they're a glass of water, and water's not very exciting, is it?
I'm Perrier, baby.
Exactly. How do you start
You're
judging?
Evian, which is nice. It's not bad, but
and you begin to see how dangerous it is to start saying, well, we can value this person based on what they're actually worth, but what they're worth is basically what we decide is valuable. And
some people are a Big Mac, some people are a Big Mac meal, some people are a mini McFlurry. That's all you are. You're a mini McFlurry. So it's a very good thing. If you want that glass to be worth something, you need there to be an Elton John. And if you want the human person, to be worth something, you need an Elton John in the sky.
So human value is entirely dependent on the existence of Elton John. That's what we're saying.
A grand Elton John, some kind of transcendent.
In the sky, Reg Dwight.
Singing the circle of life. But I find that useful, that if you want value to the human, you need something beyond the human that gives it value. Or you just value humans by their intrinsic qualities, right? Their demonstrable economic value. At that stage, that's a pretty dystopian vision.
Yep. Well, and that's where you end up with your Dawkins, where you can start saying, well, these people with Down syndrome, they're not going to add as much value as maybe this person. So, we'll get rid of them.
Right.
Right.
And it's not even maybe, right?
Yeah.
Dawkins says, do it. And we are doing it. This is what gets me.
It would be immoral not to.
It would be immoral not to.
As he says.
We have these conversations as though eugenics is either hypothetical or historical. It's not hypothetical. It's not historical.
Going on.
It's happening.
Yeah.
It's actually happening. But where have human rights actually come from then, Paul? Let's give some answers here now.
Well, yeah, I mean, and it comes again, like we keep using the phrase, don't we, of something above or a foundation, and the reason we all believe in human rights, or we cling to it so dearly, is because it's grown out of this Christian culture. It's grown out of the Bible, effectively I say Christian culture, which is grown out of the Bible. We're so infused by Christianity in the West, like we said, it's the water we swim in, the air we breathe, that we don't even really realize it has that Christian foundation to it. We just assume it's obvious in the world. But, it goes back to, doesn't it, the kind of Imago Dei back in Genesis 1, 27, God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. Right there in kind of page 1 of the Bible, you have this thing that says, well, God made all of man, and in his image, male and female. And that's where we kind of have this basis for all people being made in the image of God and being made equal and having an equal value. Whereas, and that comes out of the Judeo-Christian Bible, biblical view, because that's not the view of a Greek or a Roman, I remember, we had a conversation once, you and I where it was something like, if you said to a Roman soldier, here's this man down here who is born lame and you are equal with him, the Roman soldier would be like, what are you even talking about? We're clearly not equal. Obviously look at me, look at him.
Yeah.
What does equality, the word equality loses all meaning if you're saying that we are equal. Right. But of course, that's viewing things by a different metric there, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. Totally. And the image of God was in the ancient Near East maybe something you'd attribute to the king. And then beneath the king, there's this vertiginously steep hierarchy of value, and right down at the bottom of the serfs and the slaves, right? But this is like from page 1. No, all people are in the image of God.
Yeah, just this level.
Yeah.
Level playing field.
Amazingly flat. But then you don't want to leave it at Genesis 1, because I think that the story develops and continues as it goes through the Old Testament into the New Testament. And so maybe the next jumping off spot would be Mark chapter 1 and the baptism of Jesus, because here comes Jesus, who is the image of the invisible God, and he wants to reveal to us what God really is like. So if we are in God's image, what is God really like? Well, just as Jesus was coming up out of the baptismal waters, he saw heaven being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove, and a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, whom I love, with you I am well pleased." And actually, the doctrine of the Trinity is really at the heart of our understanding of persons. Persons are things that we had to grapple with really, really seriously in the first few centuries AD as people tried to put together their Trinitarian theology. And they started to figure out, well, if God is one being in three persons, and three persons in one being, then what is a person? And how do we define these persons? Because here we've got Father, Son, and Spirit who are distinct, who are non-interchangeable. They're in this asymmetric relationship. You can't just swap them around.
Yeah.
The Father is always the one who sends the Son. The Son never sends the Father.
Right.
The Father is pouring love into the Son is pouring himself into the Spirit out to the world. There is theologians call it a taxis. There is a way of their being. That means you cannot dissolve the persons into one another. You cannot swap the persons between one another. There is an inviolability to these persons. And so you got persons and you've got equality, because even though the Son never sends the Father, the Son is ontologically equal to the Father. They take different roles, but they have an absolute equality of these persons, and they live a life of love. The Father loves the Son, says, "You're my Son who I love, with you I'm well pleased." The Spirit is poured out onto him. So there is a moral realm that is God's life, and that life is love. So from the doctrine of the Trinity, you get this concept of persons that are inviolable, and you can't trade persons off against anything else. The most fundamental reality in all existence is persons, which is brilliant, because it means that you can't just trade off persons against some greater good. Persons are inviolable. There is a quality between them, and the good life is the life of love. So that's another thing to add into the biblical story of human worth.
And then, you can follow it through into kind of Mark 10, verse 42, where it says, Jesus called them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And there you've got that kind of what feels in many ways like that upside down system, doesn't it? The one who is the powerful one, the one who is the strong one, comes down seemingly to this position of weakness to serve. And it's through that, it's that kind of thing, isn't it, that where we have our there's a nobility to the weakness, isn't there? That we have because of what Jesus has done, through the way he steps down and serves. And so what you see there is not simply I'm the strong one, therefore I go on and bow to me. There's the powerful steps down in order to serve those who are weak as well as becoming weak, and that's a huge thing in our society. We do think it's good to give to charity and care for the vulnerable and the poor and the weak and the oppressed and all those kind of things. And again, we just assume that those, of course, are the things that you believe because they're good things. But where do they come from? Well, they come out of this biblical worldview.
Yeah. It doesn't come from the Romans, that's for sure. The rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. Yeah, obviously. What else is there? Like it was just obvious to the Roman mind that you would love your friend and you would hate your enemy, and you would not only try to do your friend good, but you would try to do your enemy down, and that's a moral thing to do. And where do we get this idea that a society is judged by the way that it handles the marginalized, the weak, and the poor? From this stuff, from the Jesus stuff. And then we could trace it through to Galatians chapter 3. So the Apostle Paul. He says in one of his earliest letters, so in Christ Jesus, this is Galatians 3 verse 26, in Christ Jesus you are all children of God through faith, for all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, nor is there male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So suddenly there is a community of utter equality where slaves and their masters are in the same church, and maybe even the slave is an elder in the church and the master isn't. Right? And they greet each other with a holy kiss. I was only hearing about this quite recently. It's such a common command in the New Testament. It's like 5 times in the New Testament. It's the most disobeyed command in all the Bible. I think that means a handshake, though, right? You've got to contextualize, don't we? But why was a holy kiss? Because you would never kiss slaves in your household. It's a family thing. A holy kiss is a family thing. That you kiss one another who are family, and you don't kiss your inferiors. And the interesting thing is, to greet one another with a holy kiss is to treat everybody in the congregation as family. Right, no matter what their station is. Outside the church, they might have many different stations, but within the church, there's this incredible,
I'm uncomfortable when people go for a hug during communion.
It's because you're lording it over them.
Yes, that's exactly it.
It's the slippery slope to eugenics.
I normally just hold out my ringed finger and
bow, kneel before me.
Oh dear.
And tracing those things through, will we be able to watch Tom Holland? Yeah. Tom Holland, secular historian, I was able to interview him last year, and he's sort of traced through this whole issue that human rights and equality, they are not these magical things that hang in the ether. They have developed out of Christian views. Let's have a look. Some of the things that are often kind of said to me, especially by humanist friends, they will say, obviously Christianity has played a part in Western liberal values, but even without Jesus Christ, we would have gotten to where we've gotten to.
No, I mean, and it's so odd that it tends to be people who valorize science and Darwin and the theory of evolution. But I'm entirely with Stephen Jay Gould on this, who famously said that if you rewound the clock of Earth's history, you would not get humans. There's nothing inevitable about the way that evolution has gone. If a creature in the Precambrian gets squashed, then potentially the entire course of life has changed.
Yeah.
We have, we
Yeah.
all have 8 fingers.
Yeah.
I mean, so, and I think the same is true of historical contingency.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing inevitable at all about the emergence of the qualities or the values or the teachings of Christianity at all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But you can't
assemble
them from other sources.
Well, I mean, if you want a sense of what the world might have looked like without Christianity, you could look at India,
right,
where you have very rich philosophical traditions, you have very rich traditions of worshipping gods. You don't have something that emerges and essentially wipes that out. You absolutely imagine a world where Christianity doesn't emerge, and that 10% of Jews and what the Jewish scriptures offer to Gentiles remains highly appealing. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of churn of conversion, but because the difficulty of becoming Jewish is such, mm-hmm. it would never rise. It would never become universalist on the scale that Christianity does. But you could imagine that there are, people continue to worship the traditional gods, mm-hmm. and that there are kind of philosophical traditions that go back many, many thousands of years. Mm-hmm. And there's no place there for Christianity in that kind of alternative world.
Mm-hmm. And could we, though, have generated some kind of universal human rights and that sort of stuff out
but I don't see why you would.
Materials? Right.
Why would you? I mean, right. the idea of human rights, mm-hmm. I mean, the idea that human rights kind of hangs in the ether, waiting to be discovered,
right.
is as theological as believing that the Lord Jesus Christ rose from the dead and sits at the hand of God the Father.
Yes.
I mean, it requires a leap of faith.
Yes.
The difference is that Christians recognise that belief in the divinity of Christ requires belief, whereas lots of people just assume that human rights are something that exists.
Yes.
But they're not. They're the result of specifically legal developments in medieval Christendom, the emergence of this theory by the canon rights by the canon lawyers from the 12th century onwards. Mm-hmm. It doesn't just spontaneously emerge.
Yes, but you hold dear to your heart those liberal values. You personally hold dear to your hearts that the weak should not be cast off, and that there's an equality of all
but I recognise now that they're not, that they're Christian values.
Yes, yes.
And of course, what it opens up is the recognition that actually, without Christian faith, then ultimately, what is the underpinning for that? Yes. And the kind of idea of that humanists propagate that somehow science proves this, I mean, it seems to me grotesque. Right. Science is a mirror in which you see what you want to see reflected back. Yes. So the Nazis use science to justify, racial genocide, and liberals use it to justify, let's, hug the world. Yes. But both of them, reflect the cultural prejudices of the people who are looking in that mirror of science.
There it is.
Yeah.
We should have just played that, shouldn't we?
Well, Tom just says it very succinctly and straight to the point, doesn't he? Just everything we've been saying really is exactly what he's just said. So,
I love the laugh though when I asked him. Could we have gotten human rights without Christianity?
No. Just completely dismissive. No, of course not. Of course not.
Nah,
don't be silly. Don't be ridiculous.
Yeah. So there is just that. Yeah, and he says. There is one thing I disagree with when he said that to believe that human rights sort of hangs there in the ether waiting to be discovered is as theological as believing that Jesus Christ rose from the dead and is seated at the right hand of the Father. In a sense, I think belief in human rights is less open to scientific inquiry. It's less open to testing, precisely because what you said earlier, I'm not going to test whether I treat you equally according to any kind of attributes that you have. I'm not actually going to do an empirical test on you to figure out whether I should treat you equally. I'm just going to take it on faith. Sure. Whereas I think there is actually evidence for the resurrection. Right. I don't think there is evidence for human rights.
No, that's fair.
It's a faith position, and it's based on the resurrection. Yeah. Go on.
Well, sometimes I just wonder whether, people say, oh, but is there any evidence for God, and all that. That's kind of a big thing.
Yeah.
I've never said back,
Yeah.
like I've never asked anyone, well, do you believe in human rights? What's the evidence for that?
Yeah. Which is the moral argument for God's existence. Yeah.
What can you point me to at all that
Yeah.
is any kind of
Yeah.
empirical fact
Yeah.
that will get you human rights that you believe in? Whereas I could at least give you some
Yeah.
about why I believe the resurrection.
Yeah. Totally. That is the moral argument for God's existence. If there are objective moral values, then they are not going to be derived from the biological realm, because the biological realm is just red in tooth and claw, right? It's just the fittest do survive.
Yeah.
And, any morality you get out of that is just the fittest should survive, which is not moral, right? So if there is such a thing as objective moral values, then it's not going to have a material cause. So there is this material, moral reality, and because it's moral, it's personal, right? And we've just spoken about the doctrine of the Trinity there, in which you've got persons, equality, and love sort of united together. That seems to be the best explanation for a moral realm.
Sure.
And without such a God, then it's a free-for-all, isn't it? It's whatever you want to do. So literally, heaven forbids eugenics. Nothing else does. So,
Yes.
Richard Dawkins, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And if you want more, do check out the Dillahunty versus Scrivener debate. Because he was constantly kind of saying, it'd be great if God could actually show himself and show that he existed. And I was like, well, that's not really the topic. We're going to talk about objective moral values. But the more you press into objective moral values, the more I think you see that God is the grounding for these things.
Yep.
Check that out.
Good.
Speaking of that debate, we actually had a letter recently by someone who watched the debate. They were a Christian, but they weren't really sure about the value of debates and apologetics and evangelism and that sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, the thing was that sometimes these debates they can be a bit abstract, intellectual kind of exercises. And, I can understand that, like certainly I know a lot of people who don't watch these kind of things because they just say, oh, well, you're not really interested in that. They don't really think through these questions. It's not their thing. But the thing he was struck by, interestingly, was when the issue of abortion came up,
right.
And particularly the elective abortion of babies with Down syndrome, and he said how his eyes were open to the implications of what happens to the weak over time in a society post-God. And actually, the conversation between you and Matt kind of opened his eyes to that, so that he was able to kind of say, actually, this isn't an abstract thing where these two people are just having a bit of a ding-dong about, who's on the right side of this here, but it actually makes a difference to whether babies are being killed. And he said, actually, he was at the gym, with his personal trainer, and he saw someone else training with a personal trainer, and the other person had Down syndrome. And he said, I'll just read what he said. And I saw a person, a child of God, my brother, living just as I live, with the same desires and motivations to grow and improve and become more than what he is. And I saw that as a society, we might decide that his life does not have value, that he might be undeserving of life because he's weak. And I'm strong, so I get to keep going to the gym and working to become stronger.
Yeah. It's chilling, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then, the aide to the Prime Minister's aide is brought on board, and he's trying to, bring back eugenics, and Richard Dawkins wants us to know it would work. To which we say, no, it is working. Yeah, you're doing it.
Yeah, it's happening.
At your behest, there are whole people groups being eliminated, and to the degree that we walk away from Jesus, we will walk into this pit. And what's been so interesting is, it sounds so fundamentalist to say it's either Jesus or the pit, right? It's either Christ and him crucified, or it's the abyss. It sounds like the heaven or hell, binary of the kind of fundamentalists we don't like. But historically and ethically, it's like, if you don't like that truth theologically, look at the history, look at what's happening, and to the degree that we walk away from Christ, we walk into a pit. The only thing forbidding eugenics is heaven, and in particular, the heaven from which Christ descended to be with us, to be for us, to die for us, to be our slave, and to rise again, to invite us all into that same family. That is the only foundation for equality.
Yeah.
So that'll do it.
That'll do.
That'll
Yep,
do.
That'll do, pig.
Richard, honestly, repent. This has gone on long enough, and lives are at stake. So let's return to Jesus. Thank you very much, guys, for joining us. Lots of great chat on Top Chat. Roger Marshall says, I've heard Christians argue that being in the image of God inherently implies being in conscious relationship, and that the image of God is only real when the possibility of such relationship exists. Conscious relationships, they seem to be reading back into the Hebrew, something that's really not there. Certainly because I'm in God's image, because I reflect him, it enables me to go on to have a relationship with God, but not everyone in the image of God has a relationship with God. So quite clearly, the image might make possible a conscious relationship with God, but it's not the same thing as a conscious relationship with God. Obviously, the person who's making that argument wants to say that the unborn are not in God's image until they are conscious. Is that the argument? That's not what's inherent to the image of God. It makes possible a conscious relationship, and obviously the fetus is possibly going to attain consciousness. But that unborn person is already in the image of God, I think I would say. Yep. Anyway, keep the comments going on the YouTube videos, and do be sharing our stuff around there. Share us on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, and on YouTube. All your subscriptions on YouTube will really help us to get seen, so please do subscribe and click that bell so that you'll receive all our videos.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for joining us, and thank you, Paul.
Yeah, pleasure as always.
And we'll see you next week. God bless. Bye-bye.
Take care.